It's not exactly surprising that there's a lot of violence in Mafia games. After all, they're based around some of the most notorious crime families in history. And when you're dealing with people like that, it only makes sense that things can turn violent really quickly. But one thing that always surprises me about these games is just how much blood there is. I mean, have you ever played Mafia? It's crazy. You get shot once and your whole body is covered in blood. A little stab wound will cover your entire chest and sometimes even your face. And if someone runs over you with a car, well then God help you, because you're going to be covered from head to toe in this stuff. Now, this might not sound like a big deal to some of you, but for those of us who are squeamish about this sort of thing, well, it can really put a damper on our gaming experience. Luckily, though, there's no blood in the newest entry of the series, Mafia. Definitive Edition. At least that's what the marketing material would have you believe. Yeah, you heard that right. This game has no blood. Well, there's a bit more to the story than that. But first, why does this matter? Well, it matters because there's a decent amount of people out there who refuse to play Mafia games for this very reason. So by removing something that can be so off-putting for some gamers, does Mafia Definitive Edition open the door for a whole new audience to enjoy the series? Well, let's find out. Alright, before we continue, I just want to make it clear that I am not making light of anyone who gets upset or can't play Mafia because of the blood. If that's you, that's totally fine. There's plenty of other games out there that don't have this sort of thing. But I do think it's interesting that some people refuse to play the Mafia games because of this, while others can look at something like this and not bat an eye. So the question is, what makes this one different? Well, to answer that question, let's talk about the types of blood that are actually in the game. Now, there are 3 types of blood in Mafia Definitive Edition. First, there's wet blood. Wet blood is basically just blood that hasn't hit the floor yet, the blood on your character after being stabbed or shot at. Then there's blood splatter, which is the blood that flies everywhere when you get hit. Finally, there's blood puddles, which is the blood that remains after you've been hit, and it's soaked into the floor. And yes, this is exactly as gross as it sounds. Now, each of these types of blood serve a different purpose in the game. For example, wet blood is just a visual effect used to show how much damage you've taken. Blood splatters are used to add a bit more realism to combat encounters, and blood puddles are mostly just used for environmental storytelling. So what exactly is the problem with this sort of thing? Well, the issue is that this type of graphic content can be a bit too much for some people to handle. According to a study conducted by McKinnon and colleagues in 2012, there are 3 main reasons why this sort of thing can be so off-putting for some gamers. The first is that they're misapplying real-world rules to virtual environments. In other words, they're getting so sucked into the game that they forget it's not real. The second is that they're not in control of the violence in the game. Remember in Mafia games, you're either doing the stabbing or shooting, or you're the one getting stabbed or shot. And finally, it comes down to personal disposition. Simply put, some people are just more sensitive to this sort of thing than others. Now, I could go into more detail about each of these, but honestly, it's pretty self-explanatory. Who wants to get stabbed or shot in the chest? No one. That's why it's important for game developers to know who their audience is and adjust accordingly. After all, they do not want to alienate potential customers by making a game that's too violent or too scary. But at the same time, they also do not want to make a watered-down version of their game that doesn't appeal to their core audience. So where does Mafia Definitive Edition fall on this spectrum? Well, if you've watched any of my videos before, you'll know that this game isn't very scary. Sure, it's got some jump scares here and there, but overall the game isn't trying to scare you. It's trying to immerse you in the world. With that said, this game is still a Mafia game at the end of the day. And Mafia games are known for their violence. So it should come as no surprise that this game isn't exactly tame. In fact, I'd argue that this game is actually more violent than previous entries in the series. Why? Well, it's simple. It's a remake of the first Mafia game, which came out in 2002. So naturally, the graphics are a lot better. So when you combine modern graphics with violent gameplay, well, you're bound to get a few people feeling queasy. So the question is, how did the developers go about making this game more accessible to new players without alienating old fans? Well, the answer, as it turns out, is a combination of technical wizardry and creative writing. Let's start with the easiest. To make this game less gory, the developers simply removed most of the blood. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3 types of blood in this game. And luckily for us, The developers were able to remove 2 of them pretty easily. The third one, however, was a bit more difficult. See, blood puddles are kind of important to the game. They used to add realism to combat encounters, and they also used to tell the player how long they've been in a certain area. Think about it. If you walk into a room and see a fresh blood puddle, you'll assume that the person who left it hasn't left the area yet. On the other hand, if you see a dried up blood puddle, you'll assume that he's probably gone. Removing this would have a direct impact on the gameplay. So instead of removing it altogether, the developers decided to use a clever trick to make it less graphic. Essentially, they made the blood darker and thicker, which makes it look less like blood and more like, well, I don't know, ink or something. Clever, right? As for the other types of blood, well, it was pretty easy to remove them. All they had to do was change the color of the blood from red to black. And then, bam, no more blood splatters or wet blood. Simple, right? Well, not exactly. See, changing the color of the blood from red to black isn't as easy as it sounds. After all, you don't want to change the color of the blood in every single cutscene. That would take forever. Not to mention, it would look really weird. So instead, the developers implemented a system that automatically changed the color of the blood depending on the context. For example, if the player character is wounded, then the game will make the blood black. But if the player character is the one doing the stabbing or shooting, then the game will make the blood red. So essentially, the game automatically changes the color of the blood depending on whether the player character is the victim or the perpetrator. Neat trick, huh? But what about the environments? I mean, what happens when the player character leaves a blood puddle behind? Well, the developers thought of that too. In most cases, the game will automatically clean up the blood puddle after a certain amount of time. But if the player character leaves the area, then the blood puddle will remain until the player returns. And when the player returns, the game will do one of 2 things. If the player character is the victim, then the game will make the blood black. But if the player character is the perpetrator, then the game will make the blood red. Now, all of this might seem like a bit of an inconvenience, but trust me, it's for the greater good. By making these changes, the developers were able to make the game more accessible to new players without alienating old fans. And it's a win-win for everyone involved. You get to enjoy the game without having to worry about getting queasy, and the developers get to expand their player base. So everyone wins. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And as always, thank you for watching.